All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. This is week 5 in an 8-week course called Understanding Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses. It is a course produced by the Theology Program, which is a ministry of the Reclaiming the Mind Ministries organization. We have done 4 weeks on Mormons, and we are now beginning a 4-week series in this course on Jehovah's Witnesses. Tonight I am going to introduce Jehovah's Witnesses, give you some background information about them, talk a little bit about the history, talk about some of the general information that you might find useful or helpful just to get a feel for what we're talking about, who these people are. And then we're going to get into a discussion of the beliefs of Jehovah's Witnesses with regards to what sorts of things a person may or may not do. We're going to focus on especially their prohibitions, the things that Jehovah's Witnesses are forbidden to do, and we'll spend a fair amount of time on those. And I will explain why we will spend a fair amount of time on those when we get to that. I think it's pretty interesting. All right, so let me just begin then by giving you some background on the origins of Jehovah's Witnesses and who they are. Jehovah's Witnesses is a religion that was started, although not under that name originally, by Charles Taze Russell. Charles Taze Russell was I'm writing the name here. Charles Taze Russell was a lapsed Protestant. He had attended Presbyterian and Congregational churches as a child, but according to his own testimony, by the time he was 16 years old or so, he had become a skeptic. Now, it's very interesting to note what it was that drove him to become a skeptic. By his own testimony, he could not accept the doctrine of eternal punishment. Eternal punishment for the wicked struck him as being unfair, unjust, unbecoming of a creator, and so he says that at that time he had fallen prey to the reasoning of the infidels. He had come to the conclusion that he really had trouble believing in Christianity and the Bible. Even though he did not become an atheist, he just, really at this point in his young life had decided that he had trouble with the whole package deal of Christianity, because the Bible certainly seemed to teach eternal punishment for the wicked, but he really could not accept that. Now, as a young man, though, Russell came across a group of people who were Adventists. Now, these were not Seventh-day Adventists. These were Adventists in another splinter group that were from the same tree of the Seventh-day Adventists. Yes, they were Millerites. You can trace all of these Adventist groups back to William Miller. William Miller had speculated back in the 1840s, early 1840s, that Jesus was going to come back in 1843. When he didn't come back in 1843, Miller said, "Oops, I'm sorry, I was just 1 year off. It was 1844. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but that's basically what he did. He changed the date to 1844, and Jesus didn't come back again." And so, to his credit, William Miller at the time said, "Never mind, I was wrong. I thought this was taught in the Bible, but obviously I was mistaken, so everyone just go home. Forget everything I said about this subject. I was incorrect." However, a lot of folks did not give up on the Millerite chronology, the Millerite dating. And so they speculated that something had happened in 1844, just not what Miller had expected to occur. And so they speculated that maybe what happened was that Jesus did something invisibly in heaven that we didn't notice down here on the earth because it happened up in heaven. And the group that especially latched onto this particular view and became the largest group advocating this particular explanation of what had occurred went on to become known as the Seventh-day Adventists. Now, I don't want to talk about Seventh-day Adventists, but they are part of this tree that goes back to William Miller. I should note that the Seventh-day Adventists eventually went on to embrace a theology that was, at least in some essential respects, orthodox. They affirmed the doctrine of the Trinity. They affirmed that Jesus Christ was God in the flesh. Now, there are some segments within Seventh-day Adventism that are not orthodox, even on some of these points, apparently, but most Seventh-day Adventists, historically, over the past century or so, have been orthodox on these points. But there was a group of Adventists in the 19th century. In fact, for a while it looked like this group of Adventists were going to carry the day, that were non-Trinitarian, that were in fact anti-Trinitarian, who rejected the doctrine of the Trinity, rejected the doctrine of the Incarnation, denied that Jesus Christ was God in the flesh. It was one of these smaller group of Adventists that were independent and of the Seventh-day Adventist denomination that Russell found in 1869 is when he first encountered them. There was a particular teacher in this group called the Advent Christian Church. The teacher's name was Jonas Wendell, and Wendell was a non-Trinitarian Adventist. A lot of what we think of as Jehovah's Witness doctrine really comes from Wendell. A denial of the Trinity, a denial of the deity of Christ, a denial of the existence of the soul after death, a denial of eternal punishment, and the emphasis on biblical chronology, providing chronological clues to the dates of various end-time events. All of these ideas come to Russell from the Advent Christian Church leader Jonas Wendell and his associates. Now, I don't want to spend too much time on the history of Russell's development, theological development, but I just want to make that observation that really what we call Jehovah's Witnesses are an Adventist splinter group. Now, they're a very successful one. In fact, in the United States, they're as successful, if not more so, numerically than the Seventh-day Adventist Church. I don't remember what the exact number is, but they are by far the two largest Adventist groups. And many people do not realize this, but Jehovah's Witnesses really are an Adventist group. In fact, some of the same things that happened with William Miller will end up happening with Charles Taze Russell's chronological prophetic speculations. Well, eventually, and it didn't take too long, within 10 years or so of Russell's participation with this Adventist group, he had gone his own way. Now, what happened was that, of course, as he joined in with these Adventists, he said, "You mean I can believe in the Bible, and I don't have to believe in eternal punishment for the wicked, and I don't have to believe in the Trinity, and I don't have to believe in any of these paradoxes or mysteries?" And by the way, one of them that he had heard about, as he was a young person growing up in a Presbyterian church, was predestination. And predestination and free will or human responsibility are kind of hard to understand how they go together in many people's minds. And so he that's another mystery that he didn't like. And these Adventists didn't believe in that either. So they got rid of all the mysteries in the Bible as far as they were concerned. Just toss them overboard and make Christianity easy to believe and claim that it's all biblical. and this is these were biblically conservative folks. The Bible is the Word of God. It's without error. You can totally trust what it teaches, but you can't trust what Christianity historically has interpreted the Bible to say, because Christianity got off track somewhere. And so now these Adventists believe that they are restoring true Christianity to the earth. And this is what Russell thought as well. He says, well, if this is what the Bible teaches, I guess I can believe it. Now there's a lesson here that we need to understand, and that is that it is a mistake to base one's acceptance of God's Word on whether it fits with your ideas of what is theologically possible or theologically acceptable. You do not go to God's Word and say, well now, God, if you're going to reveal anything to me, it better make sense, and I better be able to understand it, and I better find it to be intellectually palatable, or I'm not going to accept it. If you come to God's Word that way, you're going to end up twisting it or rejecting it. You're going to have to do one of those two things, because it doesn't really matter what you think the true answer is theologically to some of these questions. I think it's fair to assume that when God speaks, He tells us things that are going to surprise us, that are going to be outside of what we would have figured out on our own, or what we would have guessed, or what we would have reasoned on our own. So we should expect, when we read the Bible, to run into things that are difficult to understand. After all, this is God talking, and even if He makes it as simple as possible for us, we're dealing with realities about God and His relationship to the world that are likely to be beyond our total comprehension, at least in some points. But Russell approached the Bible with this presupposition that the Bible has to make sense to me. That is a fatal mistake, to make that kind of assumption. And by the way, if you're just joining us, there will be a generous period at the end of this lecture for questions and answers. You'll be given an opportunity to make a point or to ask a question. You will be asked to keep it brief and respectful. And if you fail to do that, you'll find yourself booted out. And I don't, by the way, make that decision. Somebody else will do that for us, so we can keep it clean and keep it on track. All right. So Russell eventually parted from the Adventists, decided that he had a better idea on some things, and he launched his own ministry. He launched his own work. In 1879, he started publishing a magazine called Zion's Watchtower and Herald of Christ's Presence. Zion's Watchtower and Herald of Christ's Presence. Now, the title is very significant. I just want to spend a minute to sort of, if I could, exegete the title for you of this magazine and help you understand why this is such a significant title. Russell believed that Bible prophecy pointed to his generation as the generation that was going to see the consummation of this age. 1879, he began this publication called Zion's Watchtower and Herald of Christ's Presence. He believed, and he stated this in his magazine, that Christ had already become invisibly present in some special new way that he wasn't already present. He had already become present in 1874. Okay, there's a few dates here, so let's keep this straight. 1874, he says, was the beginning of Christ's invisible spiritual presence here on the earth. That was a special presence. He had gotten this idea, or come up with this idea together with somebody named Nelson Barber. Russell kind of went his own way on some of the details, and basically Russell's not terribly original thinker, but he had his own twists, and he had a real knack for organization and for publicity and publicizing his views, which is really how the Jehovah's Witnesses became so successful. Well, Russell taught that Christ's presence was the reality of which Christendom's second coming was the misunderstanding. Christendom taught that Jesus was going to literally come back to the earth, physically present on the earth at a particular time, particular date that is unknown to us. And Russell said, no, what Christians call the second coming is really this second presence, this invisible presence that began unbeknownst to most people on the earth in 1874. According to Russell, this was going to be a one-generation period of time, and the length of a generation was known. According to Russell, it was 40 years. And so 40 years from 1874 takes you to the year 1914. And Russell maintained that the parousia is the Greek word that he's calling this invisible presence. This parousia would be a 40-year period that would end in 1914 with the reestablishment of Zion as a literal restoration of Israel and its earthly glory in what was then called Palestine, in Jerusalem, and it would all be be wrapped up and fulfilled by 1914. And that's why the term Zion's Watchtower is used, because it was a prediction that Zion was going to be established on the earth, reestablished, restored to the earth, gloriously by the year 1914. And so that's the first part of the title, Zion's Watchtower. The second part of the title, Herald of Christ's Presence, is the announcement that Christ is already present and has been since 1874. And he is presently working out the details to bring us to that climax that will be reached by the year 1914. According to Russell, 1914 was also the end of a prophetic period of time which is marked out in the Bible, according to him, in Daniel 4 and in other places, which he called the Gentile times, or the times of the Gentiles. There is a biblical reference to the times of the Gentiles in Luke 21, verse 24. And that is the text from which Russell derived the term Gentile times, or times of the Gentiles. And according to him, this period known as the Gentile times was going to be a period of exactly 2,520 years. 2,520 years that began when the first temple in Jerusalem was destroyed by the Babylonians, which Russell dated to 606 BC. Remember that date, because it's some of this is a little. There's a lot of numbers here, and if you don't like math, you might not like some of this. But this is fascinating stuff. According to Russell, Babylonians destroyed the temple in Jerusalem in 606 BC. Where he got that date, I do not know. But according to Russell, it happened in 606 BC. Well, I do know basically how he got it, but there's no historical basis for it. And according to Russell, 2,520 years from 606 BC would take you to the year AD 1914, and 1914 was going to be the end of the Gentile times. Now, there's a few problems here with Russell's argument, including a problem with his arithmetic, because 2,520 years from the year 606 BC does not bring you to 1914. It brings you to 1915. What? The reason why it does that is because there's no 0 year between 1 BC and AD 1. So to get from 606 BC and move forward 2,520 years, you would come to the year 1915, not 1914. And Russell didn't think about that. It never occurred to him. He just totally missed that. So that was one problem, and they worked on that later, and I'll tell you what they did. Well, I'll tell you what they did now. After Russell died in 1916. He thought World War I was Armageddon. For those of you who are a little shaky on your world history, World War I began in the year 1914. Russell said, aha, you see, that's exactly the year I said the Perusia would wind up and Armageddon would begin. Well, that's not exactly what he said. Armageddon was supposed to be over by 1914. But at least something happened in 1914 that was quite dramatic, and that was the outbreak of World War I. And so Russell said, see, I was right. The year 1914 was marked out in Bible prophecy, and World War I, he said, was Armageddon. Well, he died in 1916 thinking that that was the case. Again, for those of you who may be a little shaky on your world history, World War I ran from 1914 to 1918. So Russell died in the middle of World War I. He didn't see the war end and realized the war ended and, paradise has not been restored to the earth here. So after Russell died, his followers, who by the way were called Bible students during this period of time, that they were just known as the Bible students, in some of their published editions of Russell's works, quietly went in 1915, actually, while Russell was still alive, and changed the date to 1915 because they realized 606 BC, 1914, we're off by a year. They looked at this and they figured out, we're off by a year. So they changed it to 1915. Now this ought to sound familiar because this is basically the same shenanigans that William Miller tried in 1843. When that didn't work out as the year of the Second Coming, he just changed it to 1844. And by the way, this has been done more recently. Edgar Weisnant wrote a book called 88 Reasons Why Jesus Will Come Back in 1988. That's basically what the title said. And when Jesus didn't come back in 1988, he said, oops, I'm sorry, it's 1989. So a lot of people try this game. You could try this at home. I bet if you started a website saying that the year, 2012 or something like that was going to be the year of the Second Coming, you could get some followers. It's not hard. A lot of people have done this, and for some reason it seems to keep working over and over. Well, so the Russellites, the Bible students, even while Russell was still alive, changed the date in some of his books to 1915 because 1914 didn't work out. And but then 1915 came and went, and that still wasn't working. And eventually, the Watchtower Society, years later, looking back on this, they were so stuck with the 1914 date, even though they had quietly changed it in some of the books, that it was so well publicized, it had been so hammered for 35 years. That they changed the date of the beginning of the Gentile times from 606 BC to 607 BC. Now, they didn't change it because they had discovered some new historical or archaeological data that demonstrated that they had misdated the beginning of the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem by a year. No, that wasn't it. They had to change the 606 BC date to 607 to make the 2,520-year time span work and end properly in the year 1914. So basically they jury-rigged the numbers to make it work. Just to put it, not to put too fine a point on it, they basically fudged the year of the Babylonian destruction of the temple in Jerusalem by a year to fix the chronology and make it work. Now, by the way, no biblical scholar on the planet dates the destruction of the temple by the Babylonians to 606 or 607 or any year thereabouts. They all date it to about 587, 586 BC. Occasionally, in some of the older works, you'll see 588. But that's it. You won't find 601 or 602 or 603. You won't find any of those dates. It's 587, 586 BC as the year that within a plus or minus a year, 587 BC as the year when the temple was destroyed by the Babylonians. So they're 20 years off. And if you want to see a really good book on this, it's just devastating. It's written by a former Jehovah's Witness called Carl Olaf Johnson. That's Jonasson. If you try to find this on Amazon.com. Carl, with a C, Olaf Johnson, he wrote a book called The Gentile Times Reconsidered. It's in its 4th edition now. It's a massive study on this question. And what Johnson was a Jehovah's Witness, and he was challenged to prove the 607 BC date and to back up the Watchtower's chronology leading to 1914. He couldn't do it. He ended up realizing that he had proven to himself the opposite, that the Watchtower was wrong, that the date was wrong, that it was indefensible. He went to the society and said, "Brothers, I know I must be wrong here because I know you're God's organization on the earth. Please set me straight here. Please straighten me out. Please look at my research and help me." They were not able to help him. They were not able to correct him. They were not able to refute his evidence that he had found. They forbade him to talk about it. He ended up having to leave because they would not put up with him even asking the questions to anybody around him or bringing up, sharing his findings. So he ended up. I forget if he was kicked out or if he left. I think he was kicked out, and he wrote this book, published his findings, and the Watchtower has never attempted any kind of serious refutation of this book. Individual Jehovah's Witnesses have. The Watchtower never has. And I don't think they ever will. There's my prophecy for the night. So that was one of the big problems with this whole 1914 scenario, was that the beginning date for this time of the Gentiles, or Gentile times, was off by about 20 years. And even the Watchtower Society fudged on the year to make the 2,520-year time period come to the right date. Well, there's another big problem I'll mention before going on with some more interesting things, and that is that the times of the Gentiles in Luke 21:24 do not begin with the destruction of the temple by the Babylonians, but rather it begins with the destruction of the second temple by the Romans in AD 70. Luke 21, verses 5 through 36, is the version that appears in the Gospel of Luke of Jesus' Olivet Discourse. It is the speech in which Jesus explained to his disciples what he was talking about when he said that the temple would be destroyed, that not one stone would be left upon another. He had made that statement. He had made other statements in his ministry, evidently, that suggested that the temple was going to be destroyed, and then he had said so explicitly about a week before his, or less before his death, less than a week before his death. And he said that this was going to happen, that the temple was going to be destroyed, and he said it would happen within a generation, that this generation will not pass away until this has taken place. And so Jesus, in about AD 33, had predicted that the temple would be destroyed within the lifetime of those people who were listening to him, and it was. It happened in AD 70. And it's in that context of the temple being destroyed and Jerusalem being conquered by the Romans and decimated by the Romans that Jesus says in Luke 21:24 that the Jerusalem will be trampled on by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles have been fulfilled. So in context, the times of the Gentiles begins in AD 70. Not in 607 BC or even 587 BC, but 600 plus years later in AD 70. Now those are just two of, I know of about 10 different problems with this whole prophetic chronology system that Charles Taze Russell came up with. And the Jehovah's Witnesses are still basically stuck with it. Now, one other point here I'll make about this history of the chronology and the prophecy speculations, just to fill in a question that I'm sure, answer a question I'm sure is on some of your minds. If they said while Russell was alive that Jesus became invisibly present in 1874 and was going to be done doing what he had to do by 1914, how do you explain that almost a century later? Well, by the 1920s or early 30s, I forget the exact year, but in the 20s or late 20s, early 30s, the Jehovah's Witnesses realized, the Bible students as they were called then, realized that they had a problem, that the parousia or invisible presence of Jesus in their theology could not have started in 1874. And so they quietly changed it in their literature to say that 1914 was the beginning of this invisible presence, not the end of it. They just changed it. Another fudging to deal with the facts as they came to be seen on the ground. So this is not a divinely inspired or divinely led study of the Bible leading to truths nobody else had seen. These are people making it up as they go along, making mistakes, getting caught, and changing fudging the numbers and changing the explanations to fit what happens as it comes along. And a lot more could be said on that point, but it's important to get that because this is basic. This has been basic to Jehovah's Witnesses' history. Their whole history has been overshadowed by these prophetic speculations, these chronological speculations that have gotten them into trouble time and time again. In fact, after 1914 came and went, and 1915 came and went, the Jehovah's Witnesses said, well, 1914 definitely is the right date here, but, Jesus' ministry was 3.5 years. So maybe Jesus' ministry that he starts in 1914 takes him 3.5 years, and that takes you to 1918. So 1918 was supposed to be the date that it would all be wrapped up by. Well, that didn't work out either, so then they added 7 years. The 7 comes up in the Bible numerous times. You can always find a proof text for that. So they found some, they took a verse that, 7 years, and they said, all right, 7 years from 1918 brings you to 1925. And they were so sure about this. They were so sure, in fact, that they launched a campaign throughout the United States announcing that millions now living will never die because it was all going to be over by 1925. People sold their homes, they quit their jobs, they put off getting married, they basically waited for it to happen. The Watchtower Society was so sure about this. They bought a house for Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the patriarchs in the book of Genesis. They bought a house for Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob to live in after they got resurrected in 1925. Now, of course, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob never showed up because they didn't get resurrected in 1925 or any time soon after that. Well, when that happened, or didn't happen, as I should say, the Watchtower Society kept the house for a number of years and just used it as a summer vacation for the president of the Watchtower Society. That might have been the idea all along, don't you think? It's possible. Somebody here knows about this. It was called Beth Sarim, which is Hebrew for the house of the princes. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob being the princes. The successor to Russell, who led them as they went through these pratfalls of 1918 and 1925, was a fellow named Joseph Rutherford, and Rutherford liked to call himself Judge Rutherford. Didn't actually have that position legally, but he was known as Judge Rutherford. And he was the Watchtower's legal counsel. He was basically Russell's attorney. And when Russell died, his attorney took over the ministry, took over the religion. Now, this ought to sound familiar. If you were here, I think we talked about this briefly in the case of the Mormon Church. When Joseph Smith died, exact same thing happened. His lawyer took over the religion. His lawyer was Brigham Young. Not everybody agreed with that, just as in the same case with the Jehovah's Witnesses, the Bible students, as they were known. Some of the Bible students did not accept the lawyer as the true head of the religion. You can understand people have always been kind of suspicious of lawyers and mistrusting of lawyers. And apologize to any lawyers who might be in the audience, but it's been a common American sentiment and prejudice, maybe you could even call it. But anyway, some of them didn't accept the lawyer, Judge Rutherford, as the true successor to Charles Taze Russell, and they broke away, started their own little ministries, their own little mom and pop ministries, and continued to call themselves Bible students. Some of them called themselves different names, Dawn Bible students and this and that. And in fact, there are a couple dozen decent-sized groups, as well as a number of uncountable individual, autonomous, independent congregations and fellowships throughout the world that are Russellites. They are people who descended theologically from Charles Taze Russell, but did not accept the Watchtower Society's leadership under the iron fist of Judge Rutherford. So, but anyway, most of them, of course, stuck with the Watchtower Society and felt that they were stuck with it. And Rutherford did, in fact, rule with an iron hand. And he was notorious for his drinking and all sorts of fun stuff. It was Rutherford in 1931 who adopted the name Jehovah's Witnesses for the organization. They needed to change the name from Bible students because there were all these other people that didn't acknowledge the Watchtower, and they weren't about to call themselves Watchtowerites. So he called the religion Jehovah's Witnesses. And this emphasis on the name Jehovah, which Russell used the name Jehovah, but didn't make the federal case out of it that Rutherford did. Under Rutherford's leadership in 1939, the Society changed the name of its magazine to the Watchtower Announcing Jehovah's Kingdom. Now, why'd they do that? Well, first of all, the religion had been gradually shifting its emphasis away from Christ and to Jehovah. Russell was basically an Adventist, a semi-evangelical but anti-Trinitarian Adventist. Russell believed that you could pray to Jesus, for example, and his understanding of Christianity was much more Christ-centered than we associate with Jehovah's Witnesses, who are, by the way, trying to bring that back now. But Russell didn't make a federal case about the name Jehovah, although he used it. Rutherford did. And Rutherford wanted to eliminate the title Herald of Christ's Presence from the magazine because it was an unfortunate reminder that the Society had been proclaiming that Christ was present since 1874. And, of course, under Rutherford, that was changed, that it had begun in 1914. So that needed to be changed. And also, by this time in the 30s, Rutherford had decided that the predictions about Zion being established and the homeland of the Jews being restored to the land and all that was part of Russell's theology, a big part of Russell's theology. Rutherford decided to drop all that. Ironically, of course, the Jews did eventually get back into Palestine and did establish their own nation, their own nation state, their own country, called Israel in 1948. But by that time, the Watchtower had already turned its back on Zionism, as it was called, on Christian Zionism, and in fact, the Jehovah's Witnesses to this day do not see any prophetic significance whatsoever in the return of the Jews to the land in 1948. It's not a part of their theology. Well, Russell made some other changes, but Rutherford, made some other changes, but I'll pass over those and move on to another figure here, and that is Nathan Knorr. And I will have to spell that. Nathan's last name is spelled K-N-O-R-R, Nathan Knorr. Now, whereas Russell and Rutherford were both dynamic individuals, charismatic leaders, very different leaders, but very charismatic in the sense of attracting a following and liked to be, in the limelight and had very high views of themselves, really. Knorr did not. Knorr was a bureaucrat. Knorr was an administrator. He was interested in conserving and building upon what had already been done, but he was not interested in pushing himself into the limelight. Under Knorr, the Jehovah's Witnesses began the practice of publishing all of their books anonymously. You may have noticed, if you've ever picked up a Watchtower publication, that they'd never have the names of the author or authors attached to them. Never tells you who wrote the books. Well, that's a change, because under Russell and Rutherford, all the books had their names on it. When Russell was president, all the books were written by Russell. When Rutherford was president, all the books were written by Rutherford. Knorr was not a writer. He wasn't a theologian. He wasn't a particularly gifted teacher, and so he didn't do that. Basically, he assigned a group of people to do the writing. He created a writing department, ultimately, of people that wrote the articles for the magazine, that wrote the new books, and they were all published anonymously. You never knew who actually came up with the material. Now, we do know, and by the way, he became the president in 1942, if you're trying to kind of get a feel of the storyline here. Now, it was under Knorr that the Jehovah's Witnesses did something very significant. What they did in 1950 was they began to publish their own translation of the Bible. They first published the New Testament portion, which they called the New World Translation of the Christian Greek Scriptures. Jehovah's Witnesses didn't like the term New Testament or the term Old Testament. They felt that the terms Old and New Testaments reflected poorly on the Old Testament, and they wanted to replace them with more descriptive names that didn't suggest any kind of inferiority from one testament to another. That's not a bad idea, but I don't think it was necessary for them to do that, but they ended up calling the Old Testament the Hebrew Scriptures, and the New Testament they called the Christian Greek Scriptures, Christian Greek Scriptures. Well, in 1950 they published the New World Translation, the Christian Greek Scriptures. Then they began publishing installments of the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures, throughout the 50s. And in 1961, I think, you could finally get your copy of the Bible, the New World Translation of the Holy Scriptures, all in one volume. Now, the New World Translation is a very controversial version of the Bible, as you might well imagine. If a religion decides they need to publish their own translation of the Bible, it's usually for doctrinal reasons. They feel like the other Bibles that are available in the market do not reflect their understanding of the Bible in some way, and so if you got one religious group that feels it necessary to do that, that's probably why they're doing it, and that's why the Jehovah's Witnesses did it. They felt that the Bible that most people read, it did not support their beliefs. It taught that Jesus was God. It taught eternal punishment for the wicked, at least in the English translations that people were reading. And so they produced a Bible that fixed all of those problems. And we'll look at some of those interesting translations in the next few weeks as we look at Jehovah's Witness theology and compare it with the Bible. But suffice to say that this was an in-house production of Jehovah's Witnesses only. There were roughly half a dozen individual men on the committee, headed by a fellow named Fred Franz. Now, Frederick W. Franz was the anonymous author of much of the material that was published by the Watchtower Society under Nathan Knorr's leadership, and he was the head of the Bible Translation Committee. Of course, Knorr didn't have any theological training or linguistic training of any note whatsoever. Fred Franz had gone to college for a couple of years and had some courses in Greek and was a very smart gentleman. There's no question about it. Very intelligent, very smart, very well educated, mostly self-educated, but very well educated, very well read, and pretty sophisticated for Jehovah's Witnesses at that time. And he really was the chief theologian for Jehovah's Witnesses for over 40 years. About 50 years, as a matter of fact. I would say about 50 years. He was their chief theologian and Bible scholar. Now, he wasn't a Bible scholar in the professional sense. He didn't have advanced degrees. He never published anything outside of Watchtower publications. He never published any peer-reviewed journals or even books published by academic Christian publishing houses or anything of that nature. He never participated in any symposia or any, collegiate kinds of academic conferences. So in no legitimate academic sense was Fred Franz a scholar, but for Jehovah's Witnesses money, he was. He was their chief Bible teacher, Bible theologian for half a century. Very smart gentleman. Don't want to take anything away from his efforts, but he was operating from the Jehovah's Witness theological paradigm, and that shaped everything that he came up with. Now, interesting bit about Franz. After Knorr passed away in 1977, Franz took over as president of the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society and very quickly ran into some trouble. And Franz himself was somewhat responsible for it because he had, with Knorr, the two of them had really emphasized during the previous decades when Knorr was president the importance of Jehovah's Witnesses studying the Bible for themselves. Now, they weren't supposed to study it by themselves, mind you, but they were supposed to study it for themselves. They were supposed to read the Bible cover to cover, master its contents, memorize Bible verses, all within the Jehovah's Witness doctrinal system, of course, as their guide. But, in fact, the Watchtower literature throughout this period emphasizes over and over how important it is to read the Bible in the light of the Watchtower interpretations. But nevertheless, they were encouraged to study the Bible. They had their own Bible translation. The Watchtower Society in 1969 produced an interlinear of the New Testament, which had the Greek text on one side of the page and the English text on the right side of the page, and you could compare the Greek text and the New World Translation side by side, and you could, if you worked hard enough at it, you could kind of figure out what was going on there. So they were encouraging their own people to study the Bible. Well, when you do that, people start asking questions about the theological system that you're holding to, even if they might be on minor issues or in some cases major issues. And so a mere 3 years after Franz became president of the Watchtower Society, there was a big shakeup in the headquarters in Brooklyn, New York. I should have mentioned that Russell established the headquarters of Jehovah's Witnesses in Brooklyn, New York, and the Watchtower complex to this day overlooks the Brooklyn Bridge. It's basically right across from the Brooklyn Bridge. And so there was a big shakeup in the organization. Several prominent leaders were kicked out for allegedly being disloyal to the organization, and one of them was Raymond Franz, who was the nephew of the president. In fact, Ray Franz was on the governing body, the board of elders that ran the religion. Excuse me there. Ray Franz was the nephew of the president, and he was on the governing body of the organization, which was basically the board of directors of the Watchtower Society in Brooklyn and the spiritual board of elders of the entire religion, kind of their version of the cardinals, as in the Catholic Church, and of course the president of the Watchtower Society acting as a kind of a pope, if you will. Not exact parallel, but a roughly decent parallel. Well, there was a big shakeup in 1980 over some theological issues where a lot of people inside the headquarters in Brooklyn felt that certain things that had been taught were not sustainable biblically. And there was one of the reasons for this was a fallout over yet another date. If you can believe it, after the disaster of predicting the end of the Armageddon and the end of all strife on earth in 1914 and 1918 and 1925, they did it again. They predicted 1975 was going to be the big year. According to the Watchtower literature during this time, and Fred Franz was responsible for this doctrine, and they started teaching this about 1968. They taught that 1975 was going to be the 6,000th year after God had created Adam and Eve. And that after the 6,000 years, it would be quite natural for there to be the 7th 1,000-year period of human history, which would be the millennium. And so Jehovah's Witnesses expected the end in 1975. Again, some of them sold their homes, quit their jobs, decided to put off going to college, all this stuff, because they were convinced that Armageddon was around the corner, and there was no point in trying to get up the corporate ladder or get a PhD or even a bachelor's degree, perhaps. No point in getting married and dragging your wife and young kids through something like that. We just wait a few years and we can have our families in paradise earth. Jehovah's Witnesses had bumper stickers on the back of their cars saying, "Stay alive till 75," because if they could just stay alive till 75, they would never die, because they would just survive Armageddon and go into the paradise earth. Well, I think you all know that 1975 came and went without any major cataclysm in the cosmos, and Armageddon did not happen. And so that really shook a lot of people theologically, and even inside the headquarters of Jehovah's Witnesses in Brooklyn, they were questioning the whole chronology. The chronology of Jehovah's Witnesses was just in tatters by this time, and they really had a hard time dealing with it. In fact, one of the things that was shaking people up at this time was the same information that Carl Olaf Johnson was dealing with in his manuscript that ended up becoming this book that I mentioned, The Gentile Times Reconsidered. So that was one of the big issues that was going on in the late 70s. There's other doctrinal issues that I haven't explained yet, so we'll have to put that off. But just suffice it to say that there was a big shakeup. Ray Franz ended up getting kicked off the governing body and then disfellowshipped or excommunicated from the Jehovah's Witnesses. Now, why did he get kicked out of the organization? Well, the technical reason was that he was caught having eaten a meal with an ex-Jehovah's Witness. Now, in Jehovah's Witness doctrine, you are not allowed to eat a meal with a former Jehovah's Witness. It turns out the former Jehovah's Witness that Ray Franz had a meal with was also his boss and his landlord. So it's kind of hard to avoid that kind of interaction with somebody who's your boss and landlord, but nevertheless, that was the pretext on which they kicked Ray Franz out. The real reason was that Ray was also having questions about Jehovah's Witnesses' teachings on some of these issues. Well, Fred Franz died in 1992. He was replaced by another bureaucrat, much more like Nathan Knorr. He didn't last even a decade, and then in 2000 they ended up having to do some reorganization of the business side of the Watchtower. The Watchtower actually was several corporations, and there are individual national corporations in other countries, but there were two main corporations in the United States. There was one in Brooklyn, and there was also one in Pennsylvania. But the Brooklyn corporation really ran the religion. Well, in 2000, the society realized that it needed to do something because they were going to have some potential problems, because the spiritual leaders who were responsible for the teaching of the religion were also the corporate heads of the organization and its facilities. It had a mammoth, still does, a mammoth facility and several plants and and businesses that they were running and so forth, all administered, overseen by these elderly gentlemen in Brooklyn at the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society of New York. And they were scared of getting sued, frankly, and there were some things that were going on in the religion that they knew they were going to get hit with if they didn't do something. One of these was already well known, and that was the issue of blood transfusions. And this is going to lead me into my prohibitions topic, although I'm kind of already running out of time. For decades, Jehovah's Witnesses had taught that it was a sin to accept or to give a blood transfusion. That blood transfusions were tantamount to eating blood, which is forbidden in the Old Testament. And there's a repetition of that prohibition in Acts 15. And according to Jehovah's Witnesses, when you give a blood transfusion, or that is rather when you take a blood transfusion, when you receive blood in a blood transfusion, you are eating blood. And of course, when you give blood, you're enabling somebody else to do that as well. So Jehovah's Witnesses were forbidden to do that. And in fact, Jehovah's Witnesses were taught that they could not allow their children who were on their deathbeds in a hospital to accept a blood transfusion, because if they did, they would not get resurrected. They would not receive eternal life. And so there were cases of children actually dying under these circumstances. And to their credit, the medical profession worked very hard to come up with alternatives to blood transfusions and surgeries, and sometimes those were successful. And they, basically they would do an end run around the problem, and Jehovah's Witnesses pat themselves on the back for having had a part in that. But the fact is that people still died in some cases because they didn't get the blood transfusion that they needed. Well, the Watchtower Society was scared that they were going to get sued over this, because, of course, we are a very litigious society, and it was only going to be a matter of time. And so they took steps to shield the corporate business interests of the organization, of the religion, from lawsuits, so that they could say, well, our spiritual leaders say this, but the corporate heads don't have any control over that, so they can't be held accountable if somebody dies as a result of following this spiritual teaching. There were some other reasons that they did it, and there's various things here we could go into at length, but I'll have to pass over that. But we've more or less come to the present day now with Jehovah's Witnesses, and I'd like to spend a few minutes, and I don't have really as much time as I had planned on here, but I want to spend a few minutes talking about Jehovah's Witnesses' prohibitions. And I want to tell you a little story that I think will help you understand the importance of this. This story is going to sound like I'm bragging, but I'm not. It's to give you some perspective on this issue. Quite a number of years ago, I would say 25 years ago or thereabouts, I was asked by a friend at church to come and talk with his relative, I think he was a cousin, who was studying with the Jehovah's Witnesses, considering becoming a Jehovah's Witness. Pardon me again. And I was told that one of this young man was going to bring one of his Jehovah's Witness friends who was supposed to be real knowledgeable, and basically I was given the impression this was going to be some real heavyweight, smart, scholarly type Jehovah's Witness who was going to come loaded for bear with all this stuff that he was going to present to prove that Jehovah's Witnesses were right. And I was told that the topic that we were supposed to discuss was the Trinity. And that was my assigned topic. I didn't have a choice as to what we were supposed to discuss. But I love talking about the Trinity, and so I said, sure. So we got together, and here we had this big debate, I guess you could call it, where the Jehovah's Witness elder presented his arguments against the Trinity, and I, came back and responded to those and presented my own arguments, and we went back and forth like this for an hour and a half. And this sounds braggadocious, but understand the context in which I'm saying this. I think it would be fair to say that I cleaned his clock. This guy did not know what he was doing. He had no idea what he was doing. It was embarrassing how badly he did. He did not understand what he was talking about throughout the entire conversation. And why am I saying that? Well, what happened was when we were done, my friend asked his cousin, so who do you think now has the truth? And his cousin said, I still think Jehovah's Witnesses have the truth. And my friend just about fell out of his chair. And he said, were you here? Were you listening? I mean, it's obvious. He was just, he was floored that his cousin gave the Jehovah's Witnesses any credence after the conversation that they had listened to for an hour and a half. He says, how can you say that Jehovah's Witnesses have the truth after what you've just heard? And his answer had nothing to do with the Trinity. He said, well, I still think Jehovah's Witnesses have the truth because they don't celebrate birthdays, they don't celebrate holidays, they don't take blood transfusions, they don't participate in political affairs, they don't go to war. Those were the things that convinced him that Jehovah's Witnesses had the truth. Not what they taught about the identity of Jesus Christ or the nature of God or anything theologically significant like that from our perspective. No, what convinced him that Jehovah's Witnesses had the truth was they didn't give their kids cake and ice cream on their birthdays and open presents, because that's pagan. And since Jehovah's Witnesses are not pagan because they don't do stuff like that, whereas all the rest of Christian churches basically do that stuff, then obviously Jehovah's Witnesses must be the true church. They must be the true Christians. Pardon me for just a second here. Okay, so I learned something that night, and that is that my agenda may not be someone else's agenda. What really matters to me theologically might not matter so much to somebody else. And I realized the importance, the extreme importance in Jehovah's Witness thinking of these taboos, these no-nos, these things that you're not supposed to do. So I'd like to talk a little bit about this, and to be fair, I think maybe I ought to devote some time to this next week, because there's a lot here. But I'll just repeat very quickly what I just said as to what these things are. Jehovah's Witnesses are taught that birthdays are pagan. The first people to celebrate birthdays, as far as we know, were pagans. Pagans, of course, are bad people. Herod Antipas celebrated his birthday by having John the Baptist beheaded. So obviously God hates birthdays. Christmas, that really has pagan origins. I think everybody's heard this one. Christmas really derives from a pagan celebration. December 25th wasn't even Jesus' birthday. A lot of practices that are associated with Christmas are pagan. And believe it or not just the Christmas tree and Santa Claus, and you've probably heard that, but even hot cross buns. Oh, I guess hot cross buns are Easter. Well, anyway, all these things are pagan. Easter is pagan. The name Easter, of course, comes from Ishtar. Ishtar was a pagan goddess. Jesus never told us to celebrate his birthday. He never told us to celebrate his resurrection. All holidays really are pagan, according to Jehovah's Witnesses, except what they call the Lord's memorial meal, what Christians call Good Friday, but they do it very differently. It's the one day a year Jehovah's Witnesses, or some of them I should say, have communion. Jehovah's Witnesses, as I said, forbid blood transfusions. They believe that a blood transfusion is the same thing as eating blood. Jehovah's Witnesses think that crosses are bad. The cross, as a Christian symbol, is pagan, according to Jehovah's Witnesses. Jesus didn't even die on a cross, Jehovah's Witnesses tell us. He died on an upright stake. And the cross is therefore a pagan symbol, and one that is dishonoring to the memory of Jesus. It's like, people have actually used this analogy, it's like wearing a little electric chair around your neck to remember the person that got fried in the electric chair. Jehovah's Witnesses do not participate in political affairs. They do not vote in elections. They do not want to be registered to vote. To be registered to vote is itself a compromise with paganism, with this satanic world that we live in. They are not allowed to hold political office. They're not allowed to run for political office, and that's all regarded as being in opposition to the kingdom of God. And of course, Jehovah's Witnesses do not participate in war. To participate in war is also evil under any circumstance. It doesn't matter what the deal is. You cannot and basically the main reason why you can't participate in war is because it's participating in the political affairs of a government. That's just as it's worse even than voting, but it's the same basic principle. That you should not be involved in any political affairs. You should not be fighting for any human government. You should only be have your allegiance to Jehovah's government, to God's kingdom, which, according to Jehovah's Witnesses, was in principle established on the earth in 1914. Remember that Bible chronology stuff we talked about. All right, now, really, to be fair, I need, and maybe I hope this is going to be okay. Some of you probably have questions about some of this stuff. We can talk about some of these things next week in detail. We'll look at some of the arguments. I think it's pretty interesting stuff. We may get to some of it today, but in your questions. But the point here is to understand Jehovah's Witnesses as a culture, as a people, as a community, as a subculture in our society. You need to understand this is a big part of their life. Jehovah's Witnesses stick out like sore thumbs. They can't salute the flag. They can't say the Pledge of Allegiance. I forgot to mention those things. They can't celebrate birthdays. You can't go to a birthday party. You cannot allow your child to go to somebody else's birthday party, because those are bad. Let alone have your own birthday party for your own kid. And so Jehovah's Witnesses stick out like sore thumbs in the culture, and they like it that way because it makes them feel like they're different from everybody else. It proves that they are the true people because they do the right things. They don't do all these bad pagan things everybody else does, and it gives them a sense of spiritual superiority. All right, so that's a little bit about Jehovah's Witnesses, just kind of an overview. I guess I should give you a sense of how many there are. That might help you kind of get a feel for what we're looking at here. There are over 6 million Jehovah's Witnesses worldwide, and the actual number of people that follow Jehovah's Witness teachings in some way might be triple that, but they only count people who are actively engaged in proselytizing efforts. You've got to put in at least a little bit of time every week, and you turn in time cards, basically, to prove that you have done these things. And if you're active like that, then they count you as a member in that sense. There's over 6 million of those worldwide. There's over 1 million in the United States. So about 1 out of every 300 Americans, or maybe 1 out of every 100 families, pretty close now, I would say, has some kind of Jehovah's Witness history. Some people are in the family are Jehovah's Witnesses, or at least nominally believing Jehovah's Witness doctrine. So that's who we're talking about. There's a lot of Jehovah's Witnesses in America, and of course their presence is even larger than their numbers because they come door to door on a regular basis to tell people about Jehovah's Kingdom. All right, now I think I will stop at this point and open it up for your questions. I may not be able to answer all your questions about the minutia of what Jehovah's Witnesses do or don't do, but I will try to do this. Oh, by the way, I do have to throw this in. The one celebration that the Watchtower Society has never forbidden, that is the one normal, human, earthly, annual celebration that they have never put the kibosh on, is wedding anniversaries. Jehovah's Witnesses are permitted to celebrate wedding anniversaries. And I've always thought that there was a day when the governing body was scheduled to meet together to decide the issue of wedding anniversaries. But the night before, their wives had all told them, "You better not." So that's my apocryphal story about why Jehovah's Witnesses did not forbid wedding anniversaries. Let me open it up now to your comments and questions. If you are a Jehovah's Witness, I welcome you. We want to have a respectful discussion. If we are going to give priority to those who are registered for the course, so we want to give them first crack at asking any questions. If you're able to use the microphone, you may do so. I'm going to get off the mic and relinquish it. Carrie will moderate this and make sure that things go respectfully, and so I'll turn that over to her at this time.
Don't be shocked by a male voice. Carrie doesn't have a microphone tonight, so I'm going to step in here and kind of help. If you have questions, just use the key down on the bottom right to raise your hand. Yeah, and you can always also type your question, and I'll read it out loud. So, does anybody have a question? Get a hand up and let us know. Anybody? We do have someone in the room who's not a registered student, who I had a exchange with through IM, and I don't know how to pronounce your name. Tushia? Do you have a microphone? If you do, would you raise your hand? Tushia. Do you have a microphone? No mic. Okay. Okay, Larry, go ahead. I'll relinquish to you. Do they claim special revelations like Mormons to change dates? Rob? Oh, they can't. Yeah, it's. What's the phrase they use, Rob? The light gets lighter. Isn't there another phrase that they use, Rob?
Hi, yes, that is correct. Jehovah's Witnesses do not claim to be divinely inspired. They do not claim to have prophets who can produce new scripture or new revelations in the same way that Mormons do. But they do claim that they are being divinely guided in some way into greater and greater light. And so they claim the light is getting brighter or lighter, and they take a verse out of context from Proverbs. It's Proverbs 4:18. And they maintain that the light of biblical truth is getting brighter in their midst, and so they correct their mistakes as they go along, but they're moving in the right direction, whereas Christendom is moving in the wrong direction, and so that's how they justify these changes.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, and Larry had a question. What's next on the prophetic calendar for JWs, for Jehovah's Witnesses? And Tushia says the Great Tribulation. What do you say there, Rob?
Yes, well, basically Jehovah's Witnesses are currently not setting any dates, but their theology still commits them to believing that Armageddon could happen at any time. There could be, a great tribulation of some kind that will be associated with Armageddon, and things could get really nasty for a short period of time, and then you will find Armageddon will be over. Jehovah God will get rid of all the bad guys, and Paradise Earth will begin. The millennium will begin. We'll have Paradise Earth. The righteous who are left behind will be able to start rebuilding, cleaning up the earth, and basically the millennium, it will take them the entire millennium to do this. There's going to be a period of basically of renovations and cleaning up of the earth after mankind gets done polluting it, and all the bad stuff has been going on is brought to an end. So they don't know exactly when this is going to happen, but they still expect it's going to be very, very soon. And so they're still living in kind of an any-day mentality on this particular issue, but they, for now anyway, are not setting any dates.
Okay, thanks. Does that answer your question, Larry? And okay, Kara, you've got your hand up. You have a mic, right? Go ahead.
Okay, my question was this. Was I confused? Did they not originally believe in the deity of Christ, or do they not believe in it now? And if they don't believe in the deity of Christ, then how can there be an invisible reign of Christ, and how can Christ return if he's not deified? Maybe I have them confused with someone else, but okay, they believe in the deity of Christ, but he is not Jehovah. Okay, I see. I think I was just a little bit confused on that. That was my question.
Yeah, let me follow up on that. Jehovah's Witnesses would claim that they do affirm the deity of Christ, but they understand Jesus to be a divinity of lesser power and glory, of a lesser position, most importantly, compared to Jehovah God. They believe that Jesus Christ was created by Jehovah God as the first of his creatures, that he is the most powerful and most glorious of all creatures, but nevertheless just a creature. And so he's a divine creature, if you will, which is biblically a contradiction in terms, an oxymoron. But we're going to talk a lot about this in the coming weeks, especially next week. I think we'll spend a fair amount of time on this, or the week after that. We'll spend a lot of time on Jehovah's Witnesses' view of Christ, and we'll talk about their views on the Trinity and so forth. But so Jesus, as a glorious, powerful spirit creature empowered by Jehovah God, is able to do all kinds of stuff. But he doesn't come back, and that's another thing we'll talk about. Jehovah's Witnesses do not believe that Jesus is ever actually coming back to the earth.
Great, thanks, Rob. That really answers your question there, Kara. And Rob, we had another question. He comes back at Armageddon, is what Tushia says. Tushia is the former Jehovah's Witness that we have in the room tonight. You want to address that again there, Rob, for a minute?
Well, unless they have changed their theology radically in recent days, they do believe that Jesus is going to do something at Armageddon, but he's not going to physically return to the earth. Jesus is going to lead the angels in conquering the devil and his demons and destroy wickedness on the earth, but he's going to do so invisibly, because Jesus is not a physical being anymore. He's an invisible spirit, and he's not going to make any kind of physical appearance on the earth. He's not going to touch down onto the ground at any time. His second coming is really an invisible presence that will climax in the destruction of the wicked at Armageddon, which is still future according to Jehovah's Witnesses, of course. But it's not going to be a visible, physical second coming, which is what is taught by Orthodox Christianity. So that's the difference there. Now he's going to do something more overt at Armageddon than what he's doing now, and everybody will know that something is going on and that the wicked are being destroyed. And if you are wicked, you're going to get destroyed in Armageddon. So it'll be much more overt, but he's still not going to make a physical, visible appearance. There will be no second coming in that sense. And Jesus is going to live in heaven as a spirit being with Jehovah God and the 144,000, and we haven't talked about that yet, but we'll talk about that. And they are not going to come down to the earth. And so there's a two-tier salvation system that's going on here as well that we'll elaborate on probably in a couple weeks.
Okay, thanks for that clarification, Rob. Larry, hang on just a second. We had a question that was typed in that I didn't get to. Rob, the question was, do they rely more heavily on their interpretation of the Bible in the form of the Watchtower documents and other works instead of the Bible itself?
Well, the short answer to that is most definitely, because Jehovah's Witnesses are required to read the Watchtower literature every week and study it as their guide to the Bible. Now, they do read the Bible, but most Jehovah's Witnesses don't have a lot of time to read the Bible on its own. Most of their Bible study time is taken up reading Watchtower literature and looking up the Bible references that are presented in that Watchtower literature in order to see those particular statements in their context. And they may not even pay that much attention to the context, depends on the Jehovah's Witness. So they don't do a lot of Bible study in itself, but of course there are exceptions. There are extremely studious, very smart, sophisticated Jehovah's Witnesses that have read the Bible itself countless times and really studied it very carefully. But they are, of course, guided by Watchtower theology as the paradigm or the model or the system that controls the way they interpret the Bible.
Great, thanks. Larry, go ahead and type your question in then. And while Larry's doing that, Pete says, what's the best approach to witnessing to a Jehovah's Witness? And Larry has a question, what is it that draws people to the witnesses? Is it their emphasis on prophecy? So I don't know, take either one or both.
Yes, let's try to do both of those. First of all, let me talk about what draws people to Jehovah's Witnesses. I think it's the same thing in many cases that drew Russell to the Adventists. That is the anti-Trinitarian Adventists that he fell into. They profess to believe in the Bible, take it very conservatively, very literally in their view, but without all these embarrassing mysteries and paradoxes and things that are hard to understand and hard to accept for the average modern mind. No Trinity, no hellfire, no immortal soul, all that stuff, no predestination. They don't have to have any of that. Also, as a Jehovah's Witness, you can kind of thumb your nose at the rest of Christianity and say, all the scandals that have ever gone on in church history, I don't have anything to do with any of those. I'm not associated with any of those. I'm part of the true religion that has rejected all those things and rejects Babylon. And there's a lot of people that like to feel that, they want to call themselves Christians, but they don't want to have anything to do with Christianity. And Jehovah's Witnesses say, that's us. We're Christians, but we don't have anything to do with Christendom. And one other thing I should say, and that is that Jehovah's Witnesses are very studious and very committed, and these are fine qualities, and there are people who are attracted to Jehovah's Witnesses because they take their religion very seriously, because they live it out on a daily basis, because they study. There are people that find that all very attractive. And those are good qualities. I'm not putting any of that down. So as in every religion, including evangelical Christianity, by the way, people are often attracted to it because of some things that are very good, in some cases because of some things that are not so good or maybe even bad, but there's usually a mix there. And in this case, that's kind of how I would describe that. Now, I don't think there is one best approach to witnessing to Jehovah's Witnesses. That is, I don't think there's one approach that everybody needs to use. I don't have a formula. I don't have a magic bullet. They just say this and they'll convert. There isn't any such thing. But what I would say is this: most people have found that one very effective way of witnessing Jehovah's Witnesses is simply to ask them questions. Especially if this is Jehovah's Witnesses coming to your door. They think they are coming to you to teach. So let them teach you. Ask them questions. Could you explain this Bible verse to me? If Jesus is not God, then what does this verse mean? If the wicked will not be punished eternally in some kind of hell, then how do you explain this particular verse? I'd really like to get that cleared up. In other words, if you ask them questions, you're giving them the opportunity to teach you, and it may not be perceived as quite as challenging or threatening as if you said, you're wrong, because look at this Bible verse right here. That proves that you're wrong. See, if you do that, and that's common sense with most people. You don't want to do that. But in any case, asking questions is very strategic here, because Jehovah's Witnesses in particular pride themselves on being the Bible students, the Bible teachers, and they have come to teach you. So let them. And many people have found that that's an effective strategy in sharing biblical truth with Jehovah's Witnesses.
Yeah, there's a good question here, Rob. Have you written up a list of questions that guide a believer in this process. I think that's a really good place to go with this.
I do not have a specific list of questions, and the reason why I don't, frankly, is because, how do I put this politely? It's really easy to look at such a list and treat it as a shortcut. If I gave you a list of questions to ask and you didn't understand what was behind the questions, if you didn't understand the significance of the questions in the context of what the Bible teaches, you might ask the question, the Jehovah's Witness might give you an answer, and then you'd be standing there going, okay, can I ask you another question? Excuse me, that won't work too well. So I'm worried about that if people were simply given a list of questions to use, they would rely on those questions rather than engaging people in conversation, in which you naturally ask people questions that arise from your own study and your own understanding. I mean, I've had my own relatives occasionally call me up and say, a Jehovah's Witness is coming in 20 minutes. What do I say to him? What do I ask him? My answer is it's too late. I can't prep you for an off-the-cuff, informal conversation with people that come to your door. You need to know your Bible, you need to know your own doctrine, and you need to be prepared to engage in conversation. And I would encourage Christians to learn their stuff so well that you can let them start the conversation by presenting whatever it is they want to present. Because when they come to your door, you have to understand this. When Jehovah's Witnesses come to your door, they have a canned speech that they want to give. They got a little 2 or 3 minute speech they want to present to you that's based on something that they were just studying that week. So they're ready to deliver that little speech. So what I would say is let them, and then ask them questions about it. Thank you for sharing that. May I ask you a question about what you just said? Now, in order to do that, you need to be prepared to answer whatever it is or ask them questions about whatever it is that they said. But if I gave you canned questions to ask, they might not fit the presentation that they're making, or you might not know what to do for follow-up after they give you a response. So I'm really reticent to do that. Now, if you want something like that, there are books that do this. There are websites, questions to ask Jehovah's Witnesses. And if you study those questions and you think about them and you look up the scriptures and you get acquainted with the information, you might be able to use that in a profitable way. But again, I really emphasize this. What we need to do is we need to know our stuff as well as the Jehovah's Witnesses know theirs, so that we can have a natural conversation with them in which we share with them what we understand to be the truth from Scripture in a way that is allowing them to share their beliefs and think through things in a conversational way.
Great answer. Yeah. Great answer. Yeah, we really do need to know what we believe and why we believe that. And I did put the link on for the website. We do have a lot of TTP students in here, but if you know someone who isn't, or if there's someone here visiting who's not familiar with the program, we really recommend that you check out reclaimingthemind.org and check out the theology program. We're running here down to the end of our time. Does anybody have any other questions before we go on to recapping the night and saying thank you to Rob? Raise a hand or let me know. If not, Rob, you have something you'd like to close with before we do the admin stuff?
Well, thanks a lot, Warren, and thanks for stepping in for Carrie on this Q&A session. I will depart from my syllabus outline a little bit in that next week we will spend some time looking at these taboos in Jehovah's Witness lifestyle and look at what the Bible says about these things, because again, I think this is extremely important to the typical Jehovah's Witness. It's where they live on a day-to-day basis, and so I want to spend some time on that, and then we'll get into the more formal systematic theological issues, which are, of course, of crucial importance, as they pertain to the nature of God, the identity of Jesus Christ, and what Christ did for us to save us, and what it means to be saved, all of which is very, very important biblically and theologically and personally for our own understanding of the gospel. So we'll do that. And we're going to have 3 more weeks on this, so we'll have lots of time to get through this material on Jehovah's Witness teachings. And for your questions, please feel free to pass the word on to other Jehovah's Witnesses, and we'll continue with that next week. And thank you all for your great questions and comments.